the best for last, our principal organizer, Petr Kouba, is a researcher here at the Institute of Philosophy, Czech Academy of Sciences. He is an author of the book Fenomén duševní poruchy, perspektivy Heideggerova myšlení v oblasti psychopatie, which was first published in Czech, then in German 2012, and then in English 2015 under the title The Phenomenon of Mental Disorder, Perspectives of Heidegger's Thought in Psychopathology. He published also another two monographies, Margins of Phenomenology, in Verlag Thibaut 2020, and L'exode sans Moïse, L'émigration Rome comme problème politique, the same publisher. And he also co-edited three collective monographies, Dynamic Structure, Language as Open System, Medicína v kontextu západního myšlení, Medicine in the Context of Western Thought, and Franz Kafka, Minority Report. Today he will be talking about the current burning issue, war in Ukraine, fascism and anti-fascism. So the floor is yours, Petr.
Thank you very much, Petr, and thank you all for being here to the very end of this colloquium. Why are we concerned with fascism? I think everyone who is reading newspapers today knows the answer. It's obvious that the war in Ukraine is full of accusations of fascism. Firstly, fascism serves as a pretext for Russian invasion to Ukraine. But secondly, it appears also in Ukrainian rhetorics as a way to describe war crimes committed by Russian army. Fascism here points not only to rapes, killings and other atrocities, but also to a general plan to annihilate Ukrainian nation, which, according to Russian propaganda, doesn't exist. In this respect, Russian propaganda uses the same perverse logic as the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, who claims that his secret police cannot torture homosexuals, for there are no homosexuals in Chechnya. When we see so many accusations, when we see so many fascists around, to the point that the very concept of fascism uses its meaning, I think it's really important and useful to think again about the meaning of this concept. Besides, I don't want to get lost in a detailed analysis of propaganda. My point is that behind mutual accusations there is a traumatic truth. It is not a traumatic side of the current conflict, but also a historical trauma of the Second World War. What makes this conflict so difficult to understand is that we are constantly drowned in history. Current traumas appear as repetitions and reproductions of past traumas. This is why I would like to use Malibu's traumatopolitics that shows a strange omnipresence of trauma in modern politics. As Malibu claims in her book The New Wounded, I'm quoting, "It is striking to note that today's victims of socio-political traumas present the same profile as victims of natural catastrophes, tsunamis, earthquakes, floods, or grave accidents, serious domestic accidents, explosions and fires. We have entered a new age of political violence in which politics is defined by the renunciation of any hope of endowing violence with a political sense." End of quote. So, in this paper, I would firstly like to outline Reich's view of fascism, then recollect Deleuze and Guattari's revision of Reich, and finally connect their conceptual structures with Malibu's analysis of traumatic events. To begin with, let me return to the question formulated already in 1933 when Wilhelm Reich, in his Mass Psychology of Fascism, tried to understand why the German masses voted for NSDAP. Also, this political party promised something that clearly contradicted their interests: an authoritative system, suppression of civil rights, radical discrimination, and finally war. Reich dismissed the simple explanation that the masses were mystified and fooled by Hitler's political strategy. Instead, he suggested that they desired what was promised to them. They craved for a strong leader, for an authoritative system that would eliminate their freedom, and desired a new war. But how could that be? How is it possible to desire one's own oppression and, very probably, annihilation? Why do actually people long for fascism? This question has a long tradition. It started at least with Étienne de la Boétière and his Discours sur la servitude volontaire. The question, why we long for our own oppression, why we long for our own annihilation, brings me to one of the points I would like to make. It's in my opinion, really naive to believe that Russian people were simply fooled by Putin's propaganda. As a reader of Reich, I'm convinced that they know perfectly well what Putin is selling to them and crave for it. But Reich's question is a way more disturbing if we realize that fascism doesn't concern only the Germany of the 30s or today's Russia, but all political regimes, all countries and their citizens. As Reich puts it, fascism is an international phenomenon which pervades all bodies of human society, of all nations. End of quote. Not only Germans, but all people. We all have a tendency to admire strong leaders, to relinquish our personal freedom, and to sacrifice our lives for a higher cause: race, state, political party, etc. This is reflected in the definition of fascism presented in the Mass Psychology of Fascism. Fascism is neither a political program nor a political system, but a specific concept of life, a specific attitude towards life. Rather than to the field of politics, fascism belongs to the field of psychology, or better to say, psychopathology. Fascism is a general problem because it represents a basic emotional attitude that influences our feelings, forms of thinking, and determines our behavior. According to Reich, there is not a single individual who doesn't bear the elements of fascist feeling and thinking in his structure. Every one of us has a certain inclination towards fascism. It is therefore necessary to discover the fascist in ourselves and to learn how to watch over him. The biggest mistake is to look for the fascist in others and forget that we must start with ourselves. This is one thing I really like about Reich, that he liberates us from our feeling of moral superiority. And especially today, it's very comfortable to feel somehow morally superior with regard to Russian people. But as a readers of Reich, we shall not forget that we shall first of all practice our own self-criticism and then start blaming others. But if we are to detect the fascists in ourselves, we must first know how to recognize it. In the Mass Psychology of Fascism, fascism is closely related to mass mentality because it is understood as the expression of the irrational structure of mass men. Masses themselves are simultaneously determined as politically passive, irrationally influenced segments of population. Insofar as we belong to masses, we are highly susceptible to the emotional plague of fascism, as masses, under the given circumstances, are incapable of freedom. This incapacity for freedom, however, doesn't correspond to the natural order of things inasmuch as it has developed in the conditions of the patriarchal, religious and mechanized society. When Reich claims that masses are grievously irrational, he refers to their desire for social authority as well as to their ignorance of their vital interests. It is this distinction between desire and interest that makes possible his analysis of fascism. While desire is essentially irrational, interest is supposed to be rational because it reflects the vital needs of human beings: food, work, sexual gratification, communication, and knowledge. So obviously, when Reich speaks about rationality, this is not related to the logics of our thought. It is rather related to our vital needs that we share with all human beings. In the conceptual scheme given by the distinction between irrational desire and rational interest, only the fascist orientation of desire can explain why and how masses ignore their natural interests and fall prey to the ideological traps that preserve their submission to authorities. Only irrational subjection to a higher authority can explain the self-negation of people that voluntarily relinquish their own rationality. If we use Reich's terminology, we could say that desire is irrational and reactionary, while interest is rational and revolutionary. If people dared to listen to their vital interests, they would become revolutionary because they would necessarily try to change their situation. But if they follow their desires, they will be driven by their reactionary tendencies and they will rebel without really changing anything. Rebellion, thus infected by reactionary tendencies, would then bring nothing but a new enslavement. Saying this, however, we are still far from understanding the reactionary character of desire that entraps masses into fascism. For the reactionary attitude towards life would not be possible without mysticism that allows them to ignore their vital interests, to forget their daily misery, or at least to find some sense in this misery. Such a mysticism is, as Reich puts it, the primary source of all political reaction. The inseparable part of organized mysticism is subordination to something higher, to something that stands above the individual. And this higher instance demands self-denial, sacrifice, purity, and imbues human life with endless feeling of guilt. Hence, the reactionary attitude towards life is connected with a strange asceticism. To give an example of such an asceticism, Reich mentions Rosenberg's Mythos des 20. Jahrhunderts. As a leading fascist ideologist, Rosenberg based his repulsion to the inferior races on the argument that the ancient Greeks were not only the representatives of the Aryan racial purity, but also representatives of the Apollonian mentality. According to this interpretation, Dionysus, as a god of ecstasy and sensual pleasure, was of foreign origin, and the greatness of ancient Greeks consisted in the fact that they were able to avoid all the Dionysian elements. The decline of Greek culture then started in the moment when the Greeks were not able to prevent the intrusion of the Dionysian elements into the domain of Apollonian purity and modesty. Then, the superiority of Aryan race, which the Germans are to incarnate, lies in its ability to do justice to the Apollonian purity and chastity, while the voluptuous and untamed sexuality is attributed to the inferior races that supposedly have the Dionysian character. All the Dionysian elements are thus extracted from the social and individual life and projected to the outside, from which they return in the phantasmagoric figure of the Jew. What remains inside the sphere ruled by the Apollonian principle of measured behavior and formal rationality is nothing but a disciplined man who would fulfill all his duties to the authorities, and a woman who serves as a breeding machine. Surprising as it may be, Reich doesn't mention Nietzsche in this respect, but it is obvious that Rosenberg's interpretation directly contradicts the way the Apollonian and Dionysian elements are understood in the birth of tragedy, where Nietzsche neither simply rejects nor prizes one or the other. Rather, he claims that the greatness of ancient Greeks consisted in their ability to combine both these elements, while their decline started at the point when they separated the two elements and concentrated only on the Apollonian formalism and rationality. What is wrong is thus neither the Apollonian nor the Dionysian principle, but their isolation that absolutizes either of them. In any case, the Nietzschean interpretation of the relation between Apollonian and Dionysian principles leaves no doubt that the asceticism, which obsessively attempts to evade every single vestige of the Dionysian element, is the true opposite of the great art of life. In any case, it is obvious that such a asceticism and mysticism by no means concern only Hitlerism. Without any doubt, they characterize also Stalinism, if we restrict ourselves only to two main ideologies of the 20th century. As Reich demonstrates in the mass psychology of fascism, Hitlerism and Stalinism have the same fascist mentality. Reich even claims that the Soviet politicians, and I'm quoting, did more harm to the development of genuine democracy than Hitler did, end of quote. No surprise that Reich was finally hated not only by the Nazis, but also by the Soviet communists. No one liked him, and he was forced to leave Europe, finding a refuge in the United States, where he didn't end up very well, as you probably know. But obviously, the point is that the similar mentality can be found also in today's Russian propaganda and ideology that separates the decadent Western countries that indulge in homosexuality, pedophilia, drug abuse, democracy, and other perversions from pure spiritual Russia that has probably some mystical aim to achieve. Now, let's take a look at Deleuze and Guattari's reformulation of Reich's theory. Deleuze and Guattari follow the guidelines given by Reich's analysis of reactionary and revolutionary tendencies in modern society, which is evident especially in Anti-Oedipus, where they refer to the mass psychology of fascism. Their libidinal economy resonates with sex economy, in which Reich combines Freud and Marx in order to show the interconnection of sexual suppression and social repression. But this is not to say that they simply adopt some ready-made ideas. Their attitude to Reich is, despite their respect for the work of their precursor, critical. And one could say that they use Nietzsche against Reich, or that they criticize Reich in the name of Nietzsche. As an instrument of their critique, they utilize not only the Nietzschean concept of resentment, but also the Nietzschean insight into the relation between the Apollonian and Dionysian principles, which allows them to overcome the limits of Reich's vitalism by even a more radical vitalism. Reich's vitalism is determined by his antipathy towards the mechanized functioning of the modern industrial society that alienates the human beings from their true nature. Reich opposes the mechanized functioning of the modern industry that dehumanizes the human beings with the natural state of human existence, in which human beings find their meaning, the meaning of their lives in the realization of their vital needs. The essential needs, such as work, love, knowledge, and communication, thus determine the Rousseauian vision of homo natura, whose sane character is led astray by pathogenic influence of desire. The reactionary structure of desire makes us forget the vital interests of homo natura and alienates us from the true basis of our lives. Modern political regimes, be it totalitarian regimes or formal democracies, take advantage of the reactionary structure of our desire and use them against our interests. But as soon as the vital interests of homo natura are released, they will lead to the establishment of so-called working democracy, in which there will be no place for authoritative leaders and political manipulation. The paradox, however, is that working democracy is not only a future project. According to Reich, working democracy that corresponds to the nature of homo natura already exists for all political regimes, even the most totalitarian ones, needed as a basis on which they can install themselves. Without working democracy that reflects the natural human interests of work, love, communication and knowledge, no political regime can exist. Therefore, modern totalitarian regimes and formal democracies appear as perversions of working democracy, which they deform and abuse. The only way out of this situation is then a progressive abolition of the modern state and the simultaneous release of working democracy, which can happen only when the masses free themselves from the pressure of their reactionary desires and learn how to listen to their vital interests. Contrary to the Rousseauian vision we find in Reich, Deleuze and Guattari do not put nature against technology. Instead, their vitalist conception that takes into consideration the very process of production goes beyond the distinction between nature and technology. Both nature and technology are based on the process of production. Indeed, in Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari also talk about homo natura, but their image of homo natura is not Rousseauian. Rather, their homo natura has the Dionysian nature in the Nietzschean sense. When Deleuze and Guattari declare that the homo natura is of schizophrenic nature, we should not forget that the schizophrenic pole of experience has all the features attributed to the Dionysian element in the birth of tragedy. The Dionysian element is characterized as a sphere of ecstasy, a sphere of enormous joy and enormous suffering, in which individuality disintegrates. Clear forms fall apart and nothing can be recognized anymore. It is the element in which the very difference between man and nature disappears. As opposed to this orgiastic principle in which all individuality collapses and man becomes indistinguishable from the animal, the Apollonian element functions as principium individuationis. It is an element of distinct proportions, clear forms and contours, an element in which not only individual existence but also political and state organizations become possible. Since individual existence as well as political organization require certain framing, that is to say, the creation of horizon that would differentiate the inside from the outside, we can connect the Apollonian element with the process of reterritorialization as described by Deleuze and Guattari, while the process of deterritorialization seems to correspond to the Dionysian element. Considering the affinity of the Dionysian element and the process of deterritorialization on the one hand, as well as the proximity of the Apollonian element and the process of reterritorialization on the other, we can thus see that the two sides must not be separated, for the process of production can exist only in a permanent tension of their competing tendencies. In the process of production, the two tendencies must always oppose each other, but as soon as one totally eliminates the other, it leads to a dead end, which could take either the form of permanent stagnation in the fixed situation or the form of devastating collapse. Both the Apollonian reterritorialization and the Dionysian deterritorialization needs its counterpart that vitalizes and renews it. And both of them have a destructive potential that shows itself once the one or the other become isolated and absolutized. Even though the Apollonian reterritorialization and Dionysian deterritorialization must not be separated, one of them always prevails over the other. Once it is the formative influence of the Apollonian element, then it is the Dionysian formlessness. Either reterritorialization subjugates the deterritorialization, or deterritorialization dominates the reterritorialization. It is in the unstable oscillation between these elementary possibilities that the process of production comes about. Production, however, also determines the basic character of desire. Desire, as Deleuze and Guattari conceive of it, has primarily a productive nature. It is the desiring production, which is characteristic by excess and abundance, and not by a constitutive lack or deficiency. But even if desire doesn't have a negative character, it can become negative, which happens when it is bound and directed to some transcendental goal or ideal. Then desire loses its immanent character of production and becomes essentially reactive. This is possible when the Apollonian reterritorialization dominates over the Dionysian deterritorialization and shifts it to the background. In such a case, desire is primarily related to the experiencing individual who finds himself, herself, among other individuals, and together with them constitutes the political body known as a state. It suppresses all the states in which the individual, the whole net of intersubjective relations, as well as the formal structure of the state falls apart. Simply, desire is then invested in the Apollonian way, rather than in the Dionysian way. While the Apollonian reterritorialization is a synonym for the reactionary investment of desire, for it binds us to the given state of affairs, the Dionysian deterritorialization corresponds to the revolutionary investment of desire, for it liberates us not only from the given situation, but also from our own personal identity, allowing us to become something else than what we used to be. Therefore, Deleuze and Guattari cannot agree with Reich, who believes that desire can be only reactionary. Rather, they show that desire can be invested either in a reactionary or in a revolutionary way. So, for Reich, it's a quite simple opposition between reactionary desire and revolutionary needs, whereas Deleuze and Guattari don't buy this simple opposition, and they complicate it and therefore make it way more interesting. In fact, following the topology of the birth of tragedy, where the Dionysian element seems to be more primordial than the Apollonian, Deleuze and Guattari even suggest that the revolutionary investment of desire coincides with the true nature of desire, and in this sense is more primordial than the reactionary investment of desire. But this doesn't mean that they overlook the dangers of reactionary mentality, the first one of which is the danger of resentment. Quite to the contrary, they focus on the various ways in which desire, which is originally revolutionary, becomes reactive, so that they can expose all the traps that alienate desire from its immanent nature and turn it into the infinite longing for a transcendental ideal. Yet, things become even more complicated when we realize, as Deleuze and Guattari do, that Reich's distinction between irrational desire and rational interest is not tenable anymore. As I already suggested, it is a mistake to believe that desire represents the irrational side of human mind that is abused by the authoritarian social regimes, whereas the interest expresses the rational character of social relations. For such a differentiation makes an impression that desire can be and must be rooted out of the social field. Accordingly, desire would be in principle separable from the social sphere, which is something Deleuze and Guattari who demonstrate the coexistence of the desiring production and social production cannot accept. In Anti-Oedipus, desiring production is coextensive with the sphere of social production, where various interests clash. Desire may be unconscious and interest may be conscious, but this doesn't mean that they can be separated from each other. Rather, it is desire what opens a field in which interests can be articulated. Interests can appear only in the field predetermined by desire. Therefore, one can neither presume, as Reich does, that desire in itself is reactionary while the interest is in itself revolutionary, rather than putting the reactionary and irrational desire against the revolutionary and rational interest. One should allow that desire can be either revolutionary or reactionary, and the same applies to the interest. One must therefore learn how to distinguish the revolutionary investment of desire from the reactionary investment of desire, and the revolutionary interest from the reactionary interest, which is, however, complicated by the fact that the revolutionary interest can go with the reactionary investment of desire, and the reactionary interest can be driven by the revolutionary investment of desire. The true revolutionary movement then requires not only revolutionary intentions, but also such an investment of desire that has the Dionysian character, that is to say, that smashes all the firm structures and formal hierarchies that determine the role of the individual and segregate some individuals from others. It is, as Deleuze and Guattari put it, schizophrenic, nomadic, pluralist and polyvocal. Reactionary movement, on the other hand, can be recognized not only by reactionary declarations, but especially by the Apollonian investment of desire, that is to say, such an investment that formally determines the role of the individual in the hierarchic social structure, which necessarily excludes those who are classified as different. The reactionary investment of desire is thus paranoiac, segregative, unified and univocal. We could also say that the reactionary investment of desire requires unity, unanimity, discipline, obedience, and segregation of those who do not comply with such requirements, whereas revolutionary investment of desire opens a space for plurality of voices and opinions, for their shifts and changes, and has quite a big tolerance for those who are not same as we are. This juxtaposition corresponds to the difference between two sorts of groups, subjugated groups and group subjects, that are differentiated on the basis of their ability or inability to accept the finitude and temporariness of the group as such. In this respect, I would dare to read Deleuze-Guattarian social theory as a kind of remembrance of the Heidegger's philosophy of finitude, where everything turns around or ability to accept or very finitude. And in the case of subjugated groups, what we see is precisely inability to accept the finitude of the social group, which allows us then to sacrifice the individual in the name of the social group. To the contrary, group subjects are capable to accept their own finitude. They are therefore able to improvise, they can make new connections. And this very acceptance of their own finitude makes them more free and flexible. So, it appears that the subjugated groups are way more rigid, whereas group subjects are capable of institutional improvisation, for they see the social group as something provisionary and temporary. The difference between subjugated groups and the group subjects may remind us of Reich's distinction between authoritarian and non-authoritarian society. The first kind of society is based on the powerlessness of masses, on their desire for a higher authority that would redeem and release them from all the responsibility for their lives, whereas the other kind of society refuses any higher authority or rigid social structure and puts all responsibility in the hands of people. While the authoritarian social order tends to eternalize its own structure, the non-authoritarian social order is self-regulatory and changeable. It makes its members responsible for the direction and drifts of social processes. In the non-authoritarian society, people are thus not relieved of their social responsibility. They are burdened with it, according to Reich. This is, nevertheless, the point on which Deleuze and Guattari would differ. For the concept of responsibility is for them still tied to the reactive structure of resentment. The truly revolutionary process is, according to them, driven by the Dionysian deterritorialization, which dissolves not only all the rigid social structures, but also the individuals shaped by the power of social schemes. That is to say, those individuals that are supposed to be responsible and feel guilty. Revolutionary processes shake precisely this tendency to be responsible and feel guilty, whereas the reactionary processes strengthen the feeling of responsibility and guilt. We should not, however, forget that neither revolutionary nor reactionary processes as such separate the Dionysian element from the Apollonian element. In the revolutionary processes, as well as in the reactionary processes, the Dionysian deterritorialization and the Apollonian reterritorialization go hand in hand, and all depends only on which one of them prevails. When the Apollonian reterritorialization dominates, we see the rising power of the state apparatus, with its smaller structures of bureaucratic hierarchies, social classes, and individual roles. When it is, to the contrary, the Dionysian deterritorialization that prevails, the subversive war machine performing molecular transformations dissolve the molar structures of the state and opens lines of escape from the captivity of the state apparatus. In A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari describe the antagonistic relations between the state apparatus that opens on the molar level by means of reterritorialization and the war machines that operate on the molecular level by means of deterritorialization. The state apparatus and the war machines coexist in an antagonistic way. When the state apparatus attempts to capture and take control of the war machines using them for the purposes of reterritorialization, while the war machine shakes the power of state apparatus, making its molar structures transform along the line of deterritorialization. All this is not without dangers, and it would be a great mistake to presume that the dangers are only on the part of the state apparatus. Deleuze and Guattari are fully aware that the dangers are both on the part of the state apparatus and on the part of war machines. These threats become imminent when the reactionary processes come to the point where the Apollonian reterritorialization gets isolated and absolutized, or when the revolutionary processes go so far that the Dionysian deterritorialization becomes the only and absolute goal. While in the first case, we have to face the totalitarianism in which the state apparatus eliminates all the lights of escape and possibilities of deterritorialization by the violent reterritorialization. In the second case, we are confronted with fascism in which the state apparatus collapses under the influence of war machine that drives it to the absolute deterritorialization. Therefore, totalitarianism is characteristic by an endless stagnation in which, despite all the slogans about the progress, nothing new happens, whereas fascism can be characterized as an effort to destroy the state and everything that belongs to it in the cataclysm of absolute war. Fascism doesn't just produce a hegemonic situation in which the state apparatus re-territorialize all social and individual processes in its central structure. The real aim of fascism, according to Deleuze and Guattari, is not to keep the social and individual reality unchanged, but to destroy everything. What determines the nature of fascism is not a hypertrophied re-territorialization, but deterritorialization that ends in the void of ecstatic annihilation. As we read in A Thousand Plateaus, in fascism, the state is far less totalitarian than it is suicidal. There is in fascism a realized nihilism, unlike the totalitarian state, which does its utmost to seal all possible lines of flight. Fascism is constructed on an intense line of flight, which it transforms into a line of pure destruction and abolition. End of quotation. For this reason, Deleuze and Guattari make a distinction between Stalinism, which is for them an example of the totalitarian regime, and Hitlerism, which demonstrates all the suicidal tendencies of fascism. They do not subsume Stalinism and Hitlerism under the same category of totalitarian, authoritarian rule as Reich does. For they understand that the essential difference between totalitarianism and fascism issues from two basic ways in which the Apollonian re-territorialization and Dionysian deterritorialization can be isolated. When the Apollonian re-territorialization becomes hypertrophied, or when the Dionysian deterritorialization becomes absolutized, we enter into the domain of political or social pathology, to become aware of the political and social dangers represented by totalitarianism and fascism is important, especially for those who are engaged in some kind of resistance against the existing social order. The problem is not only on the side of political motivation. Of course, those who are involved in a movement of resistance should make sure that their activity is directed by affirmation of something and not by reaction or resentment, which would hide the desire for vengeance behind the declared call for justice and liberation. So, again, as Deleuze and Guattari remind us, it's easy to be anti-fascist on molar level and not even see the fascist inside you. The fascist you yourself sustain and nourish and cherish with molecules both personal and collective. In this way, Deleuze and Guattari repeat Reich's gesture and they accept his ethos of political self-criticism. In any case, the situation Deleuze and Guattari describe is much more complex than the one pictured by Reich. This is evident, among other things, from the way the process of revolutionary activity is understood in Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus, though the term revolution is not always used explicitly. Contrary to the mass psychology of fascism, where being revolutionary means the rational rebellion against intolerable conditions in human society, the rational will to get to the root of all things and to improve them, becoming revolutionary, is there delineated as an active escape from the given situation, which doesn't mean it's abandoned, but it's creative transformation. Rather than a rational activity that brings people from irrational illusions to their real interests and needs, becoming revolutionary is a process of deterritorialization that employs the mechanisms of the war machine against the state in order to change the social situation. But if the movement of deterritorialization is not to end up in a trap of fascism, it must not only destroy old codes and structures, but also make possible new connections. It must not simply dissolve all moral structures that are related to the state apparatus, but rather transform them in molecular flows that reshape the role of the individual as well as its place in the net of social relations. The relation between molecular and molar level, between the war machine and the state apparatus, must be always preserved, even though the transformed structures undergo radical disintegration and following or concurrent reintegration. The deterritorialization and reterritorialization must always operate together in Deleuze and Guattari. Well, in the remaining time, and I don't think I have much time. I would like to, as I promised, take a look at Malibu's traumatopolitics, which I believe can serve as a perfect complement to Deleuze and Guattari's social and political theory. Because it seems to me that there is something that remains out of Deleuze and Guattari's complex depiction of social life. Besides revolutionary deterritorialization and reactionary reterritorialization, there is something that influences and complicates their interplay. What remains behind the scene is, in my opinion, the phenomenon of trauma, which uncovers the bottom of our individual and collective self-destruction. It is no coincidence that Freud, in his Jenseits des Lustprinzips, relates trauma represented by war neuroses to the death principle, with its infinite repetition and regression to the unorganic. Catherine Malabou, then, in The New Wounded and also in Ontology of the Accident, employs the concept of trauma, which creates a new subject who is unable to deal with its past experience and yet is incapable of leaving it. Such a subject literally lives in the past traumatic experience, which prevents him or her from an adequate encounter with new situations. What is important in this respect is that trauma appears to the traumatized people as an event rather than an experience. It creates discontinuity, after which life is never the same as it used to be. Using Malabou's expertise in neuroscience and neuropathology, we can show the traumatic side of events that are too brutal, sudden, or overwhelming. It seems to me that such a concept of trauma is an important complement to Deleuze-Guattarian analysis of social topology. It makes it possible to understand why people ignore their real needs and interests. It explains self-destructiveness both on the individual and collective level. The concept of trauma explains many current political problems, such as political isolationism, undue aggression, inability to act adequately with respect to current political and economic problems. To mention just a few examples of traumatized societies, we may think of examples like the civil war in former Yugoslavia, or contemporary Russian politics that continues to reenact all traumas from the Second World War. Belarusian writer and Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich depicts in her books horrors of the Second World War seen from the perspective of women and children. And this is the era that formed mentality of Vladimir Putin, together with Stalinism and glorification of Russian war heroism. For Vladimir Putin, the Second World War has never ended. He wants to finish it today and thus reproduces it ad infinitum. Malabou's concept of trauma appears to be extremely important and relevant, for it allows us to understand social atomization, isolation, and stratification as results of post-traumatic disorders in society. Politics of ethnic or class identity can be thus viewed as a reaction to previous traumas, such as terrorism, wars, ethnic cleanings, poverty, or unemployment. Paranoid tendencies in society that do not correspond to real problems and dangers can be explained as expressions of post-traumatic disorders. Paranoid investments of desire in society can thus become something that can be repaired without using a derogatory language. And in this respect, I find Malabou again very important, and I would compare her to Reich, because she deprives us of this comfort to have the moral superiority with regard to others. To the contrary, the concept of trauma allows us to empathize with others, even though we strongly disagree with them. I can see the traumatic past on the Russian side, but it doesn't make me agree with the Russian politics. I can see the motives that are behind the actions. I can criticize those actions, but still I need to firstly recognize myself as someone who is traumatized, possibly traumatized, or member of traumatized community, rather than putting myself above the others. But in this respect, we also need to ask ourselves what is a politics that heals old traumas rather than profiting from them? What is a politics that allows people to see their true needs and follow their interests? What is a politics that makes possible new connections instead of breaking social connections by newly produced traumas? In this respect, we can use, again, Malabou's dichotomy of constructive plasticity and destructive plasticity. Both are related to the traumatic event. Constructive plasticity, as something that creates new connections, is opposed to destructive plasticity, which makes life freeze in the endless repetition of trauma. While constructive plasticity opens new possibilities of individual and social life, destructive plasticity conserves unnatural conditions of life or destroys all possibilities of life. In one way or the other, it totally prevents any spontaneous social movements. Perhaps it is this moment of destructive plasticity what we need to add to our reflection of fascism and totalitarianism. And we can surely say that Vladimir Putin is a great operator of destructive plasticity, in a sense that he uses old traumas for political purposes and multiplies them by new traumas. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Petr. It was great. Are there any questions? Okay. So
mine's off course, so only if there's
time. Start with you.
Yeah, this is a little off course though. It's more in the medical, bringing you back to the illness. So I think you have to bracket a lot of things which I'm not even going to name in order to maybe answer this question or think about it. And if not, then we could talk over dinner and just move to the next questions. But I've been thinking a bit about fascism as it's been playing out during COVID, and sort of the destruction of personal relationships when, for example, loved ones are prevented from being with their dying loved one, and then this sort of annihilation of love and family and connection and the social acceptance of it, seen as preserving humanity or something of that sort, and then the authority being medicine, science, the physician, and so I just here I just in my own observations I see there's very little on the outside of this in terms of a critique. We're sort of all, when you talked about guilt and responsibility, it's on both sides. My loved one died. I feel guilty and responsible. I wasn't with them. I was literally prevented from being with them. But then this other side, which is, well, you have to be so responsible, and you know, you would be guilty if you went with this person and come out and spread the virus or whatnot. So I was just thinking about fascism in that context.
Thank you very much. It's a brilliant example, and of course a very difficult one. But I think the easiest way to approach such a situation is to use the concept of trauma, which allows us to provide not only neutral description, but very empathetic understanding of how the people involved in such a situation must have felt. And I think you know, when we ask ourselves what is adequate approach to trauma, and from medical perspective, there are two basic aspects that appear to be vital, and it's safe environment and transitory justice. So when we are dealing with trauma, and I'm speaking not only of individual trauma but also of collective trauma, the true medicine and true politics that is adequate to trauma is precisely the one that provides safe environment and transitory justice. When it comes to politics, I'm thinking of commissions of truth in South Africa, for instance, where precisely this transitory justice, which is far from being perfect, appears to be healing. It is something that brings people together rather than separating them and making them fight against each other. And I think something like this might be helpful when we try to reconcile and heal the wounds that appeared during the COVID times. And precisely, even though I disagree with anti-vaxxers, the concept of trauma, when I accept that they are traumatized, allows me to see their point, to see that they are, you know, they fear that they are losing their freedom. They suffer from precisely those deprivations when they were not allowed to be with their close ones in the moment of death, and so on and so forth. So I think the concept of trauma appears to be very, very helpful in this respect.
Okay, so it's interesting. I'm teaching a care ethics course, and we're looking at some people who are looking at sort of how it would work as a political framework. I think Toronto is the name, but there's a movement in the criminal justice system that is still very nascent, but it's restorative justice and I'm sure that's not an unusual or unknown idea, but I was very surprised to find out how it had actually been integrated and sort of was beginning to be accepted within sort of criminal justice echelons in the United States. And it's based on exactly this idea, same thing with the truth commissions, etc. But my question is this, and so whose trauma? So it seems that we would have to also, so not just have a conception of trauma, but also have to deal with the fact that we still have to get over the hurdle that some people's traumas matter, and some do not. I mean, there have been communities, the indigenous people in the United States, and I'm using my examples because, of course, I'm from the United States, and then, you know, Black Americans who have been expressing and who have, you know, for anyone to see, that many of the things that they, you know, deal with, and they're absolutely related to deep trauma. And it's rejected and it's denied, and it's actually a part of the sort of fabric of the United States in terms of white supremacy to continue to reject that trauma and minimize it. And so I guess my question is, are there any resources to not just sort of conceptualize trauma, but to, in Malibu or even if you can think in terms of the DELEUZE framework, to engender some kind of acceptance or empathy, that it would be a requisite for trauma, because there are, you know, traumas that seem to matter more than others, and I don't know how to get around that.
Well, first of all, I would emphasize that all traumas are in principle equal.
Well, right,
And
but
principally, but this is an important point, and moreover, it is trauma what makes us equal, because all societies are to some degree traumatized. When speaking of United States, the Civil War is a perfect example of long-term trauma that wasn't healed 150 years after the war, and that still it is a present open wound that shows injustice, that shows hard feelings and unresolved tensions, even so many years after the war. So by no means can United States of America feel somehow superior with regard to Russia, for instance, because trauma is something that divides us, but it also unites us. It shows us that to some point, to some degree, we are all traumatized. And in this contribution, I basically try to enrich the Deleuze theory that that works with this opposition of paranoid and schizophrenic tendencies that are accompanied by paranoid and schizophrenic articulations of interests and so on and so forth. And I would like to argue that in this differentiation that is already very complex, we should take into consideration also the aspect of trauma and ask ourselves what is the politics that rather heals old traumas than taking advantage of them, or then producing new traumas. And I think this is quite important factor that we need to acknowledge. And I think this would make Deleuze and Guattari's social theory and also politics way more complex, way more interesting. And I totally agree with you that officially and in official state ideology there is still a huge gap and inequality when it comes to traumas of minorities that are neglected, that are still suppressed, and to the official traumas of, let's say, heroic people of Russia who beat the Germans and can celebrate forever this victory. So of course there are traumas that are officially acknowledged and celebrated, and there are forgotten traumas.
But I take your point, and I absolutely, it's a great addition to the analytic, I think, yeah. So thank you, that's really great.
You don't mind if Anthony
says
something related, I suppose?
Yeah. I'm kind of thinking on the fly here, but Fanon talks about colonialism as traumatic for all parties involved. If you look at the French trauma as well as the trauma of those colonized. So I wonder then if you would say, perhaps when you're talking about something at a large scale like slavery, indigenous genocide, it's not a matter that there's different traumas, but there's a social trauma which impacts different populations differently. So therefore, a trauma-informed politics would be one that understands that it's one trauma that has different.
And that would sort of hopefully eliminate the divisiveness.
Yeah. Because then you can start thinking about how it's an equal trauma and then work through it in a way, or something else.
Yeah, I would argue that through trauma we should. And we can really empathize with others who have totally different opinions, totally different positions. And I think when you speak of the colonized and colonizers, I think that the recognition of the trauma is something that could bring us together once we take it seriously, and once we take it as something we can deal with, and not only something we can complain about, but something that can be taken care of. In Africa there are social practices of reconciliation, of bringing peace into community, that actually heal traumas when you have perpetrator of a crime and the victim, and those social practices make it possible to heal not only the one who was hurt but the whole community, and I think the basic principle is precisely this acknowledgement of trauma.
Yeah, I actually think you largely answered what I was going to say in these previous exchanges. But my original worry was that talking about trauma has this, the same kind of all traumas are equal has this kind of flattening effect where we've all just, and I can see the value of the empathy, but also the sense of this kind of flattening of thinking that we've all somehow had the same experience. And I think I now feel more satisfied on kind of on a kind of ethical or kind of political level, but on a kind of explanatory level, I still feel like I worry that there's something, you know, like if you want to say what I know you're not claiming that trauma is the only explanation, but even if we're going to say what's happening, what Putin is doing can be explained through trauma. Where's the material for distinguishing, you know, between, you know, putting it really crudely, but like Russia as a historically imperial power versus Bosnia as very much not, right? Where's our space for making those distinctions?
Well, and this is a huge simplification. I'm well aware of this, and then there is already massive theory and practice of trauma healing. Both on individual and collective level. But I would put emphasis on this aspect of transitory justice. It is not the final justice, but this transitory justice means that evil is called evil. So the war is war. Rape is rape, and instead of the hypocrisy of power that likes to use some soft words. Torture is the third degree of interrogation, or in intensified interrogation. War is special operation. This hypocrisy of power is something that we should get rid of, and we should embrace this possibility of this imperfect transitory justice, which, however, makes it possible not only see the suffering of the others, but basically come back to reality, overcome the ideological traps in which we are all somehow, and come to terms with social reality where people suffer, where people are killed, and where simply war is war, and rape is rape, and slavery is slavery, and nothing can legitimize it. So even though it's imperfect justice, it is still something that is already, if it is provided in a safe environment, is already meaningful and helpful. So this would be my answer, transitory justice. Like in South Africa and those commissions of truth.
First of all, I wanted to thank you for bringing together a book in which I've been living for the last 4 years, which is Anti-Fascism, and something that's been really heavy on all of our minds in the past few months. I think that the way you talk about trauma is very helpful. It opens a lot of possibilities of thinking about a lot of conflicts, not just Ukraine, but for example Israel and Palestine. And but I want to sort of come back to something that you said that I sort of understand, but would like you, if you could maybe clarify. And that's that you mentioned, and I don't know when that was, but you mentioned that trauma is sometimes experienced as an event and not as experience. What do you mean by the difference?
Yeah, I need to explain it, and thank you very much for reminding me. This comes from Malabou's own theory. For instance, in her article Post-Trauma, she criticized Zizek's and psychoanalytical approach to trauma, which grasps trauma in terms of experience. Basically, trauma is here understood as something that you called for, as something that you are partially responsible, something that is made possible by some ur-trauma, by some past trauma. And using her expertise in neuroscience and neuropathology, Malabou prefers the concept of event that stresses the impossibility to come back before trauma, to return before trauma. It shows the gap that appeared in individual or collective life through the trauma. So, since you mentioned Israel, I would just remind us of the huge shift in psychoanalysis. Basically, we can read the whole history of psychoanalysis, beginning with Freud, through Jung, but also Bettelheim and Frankl, as various attempts to come to terms with trauma. And it was precisely the experience of concentration camps, of the survivors, that forced psychoanalysis to totally change the way of asking. You know, the people who were in the concentration camps didn't ask, why did I end up here? It made no sense for them, because they were selected from the rest of population. They were targeted as a special social or ethnic group. So the point was not to ask why I'm suffering so much, why I'm here in a concentration camp. Rather, in psychoanalysis there appeared the big transformation of the question, namely people like Frankl or Bettelheim ask themselves, how did I survive this? How was it possible to survive this? So I would say that also in this case, trauma was understood not as an experience, but mainly as an event, as something that makes no sense. It is rather a radical separation from your past life. It is something that prevents you from living as you used to live. And so this is not what Malabou is saying, but for her, for theoretical reasons, it is quite essential to see trauma not as Erlebnis, but as Ereignis. And this is basically her way of criticizing psychoanalytic approach to trauma. And I think this is also what brings her close to Deleuze and Guattari. Because as Petr Prášek in his talk beautifully demonstrated, in Deleuze and Guattari we see the ethics of event. And Malabou, for instance, in Ontology of Accident, explicitly draws on Deleuze and Guattari, and she develops sort of ontological description of distractive plasticity, and also the ontological description of traumatic events. And I think what she could add to Deleuze-Guattarian theory is precisely the radicalized understanding of trauma. That trauma is really something devastating that brings our lives to the end or totally changes them.